like the rushing of a mighty wind, like the rushing of a mighty wind.
I just want to do a little bit of reading. I want to do a little bit of chat GPTing about Assata Shakur and just ask chat GPT what her legacy is best described as. And that's pretty much what I want to talk about. I've seen the difference in the reaction to her death compared to the reaction to Charlie Kirk's death from the Black community and FBA in particular. They've been very I guess mournful of the passing of Assata Shakur, but could really care less about Charlie Kirk's passing. They kind of actually cheered it on, if you will. They cheered on Charlie Kirk's death, but mourn for Assata Shakur. And we want to talk about kind of why that is and what the implications of that is. So we just want to talk about that a little bit. So, as usual, we are going to do a little bit of chat GPTing. And I asked chat GPT, who is Assata Shakur? And it says Assata Shakur, born JoAnne Deborah Byron, later Chesimard in 1947, is a prominent figure in Black liberation history. She was a member of the Black Panther Party, BPP, and later the Black Liberation Army, BLA, during the late 1960s and 1970s. Her background. And I guess, the fact that she's a member of the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army right out the gate kind of tells us why FBA would support her and mourn for her. So I guess that's pretty self-explanatory. But her background: she was born in Queens, New York. She grew up facing racial and gender discrimination, which shaped her activism. She joined the Black Panther Party in the late 1960s, where she became involved in community programs and organizing. Later, she became part of the Black Liberation Army, a more militant underground group that split from the Panthers and advocated armed struggle against systemic racism and police brutality. So she was a radical. She was definitely a radical Black activist who kind of went as far as she felt she wanted to go or needed to go with her activism. She was a strong activist and a committed activist to her cause. But let's kind of go into and see what her cause and what her cause was, I guess. Legal cases and escape. In 1973, Shakur was involved in a shootout on the New Jersey Turnpike with state troopers. One officer, Werner Forster, was killed, as well as a BLA, Black Liberation Army member. So she was a strong activist. She went all out. She wasn't afraid to do whatever she felt was necessary for the freedom of her people. It goes on to say Shakur was wounded, arrested, and later convicted of murder. Though her supporters argue she was unfairly targeted, citing weak evidence and political persecution by the FBI's COINTELPRO program. In 1979, with help from allies, she escaped from prison and eventually fled to Cuba, where she was granted political asylum. So, she was, I guess, a political refugee, if you will. And again, everything that can be said by America to be negative, I guess Assata Shakur was involved with. I mean, this is deep stuff off the bat. In a shootout with police, one police was shot and killed, and she escaped prison and fled to Cuba. Like, that is some gangster type stuff. Yeah, that's real gangster. And again, that would also explain why FBA would support her, because, FBA culture is hip hop gang culture. So they really admire that type of thing in their Black activists, where, they go all out and can be said to be gangster, even, where they take it to the limit, But it says her life in Cuba. So she escaped from prison and fled to Cuba. Her life in Cuba. In Cuba, she has lived in exile since the 1980s, continuing to write and speak on issues of race, justice, and oppression. She wrote an autobiography, Assata, an autobiography in 1987, which has become influential in Black radical and activist circles. U.S. government status. The FBI lists her as one of the most wanted terrorists and has a $2 million reward for her capture. The Cuban government has repeatedly refused U.S. demands to extradite her, seeing her as a political refugee. In short, Assata Shakur is both a symbol of resistance and liberation to many activists, and a fugitive terrorist in the eyes of the U.S. government. And I think that's kind of, the reason why FBA can put support behind her and, mourn for her, is because she is a symbol of resistance and liberation for them. And also because she's seen as a fugitive terrorist in the U.S., from the U.S. government's perspective. Whatever the U.S. government is against, Black people tend to be more for. The U.S. government is against it, Black folks is for it, for the most part. So let's continue and see what else it says about her. So the next question I asked is, was she a Pan-Africanist? I know she was a rebel, if you will, even considered to be a domestic terrorist. But was she a Pan-Africanist? And ChatGPT says yes. Assata Shakur has been associated with Pan-Africanist thought, though she wasn't primarily a Pan-African theorist like W.E.B. Du Bois, Marcus Garvey, or Kwame Nkrumah. The Pan-African influence in her politics, solidarity with Africa and the diaspora. In her speeches and writings, she often framed the Black struggle in the U.S. as part of a larger global fight against colonialism, imperialism, and racism. Cuban exile and Pan-African networks. Living in Cuba, she connected with African, Caribbean, and Latin American revolutionaries, which deepened her global perspective. Her autobiography. She reflects on the interconnectedness of oppressed peoples worldwide, aligning with Pan-Africanist ideas of unity. And, I think this kind of hits at the heart of why I find it hard to be a Pan-Africanist. There are a bunch of reasons, but this here is absolutely one of the main reasons, because Pan-Africanism and Pan-Africanist movements always seem to find themselves tied into what can be labeled as, terrorist organizations against America. They see themselves as liberation movements, but they can be seen as terrorist organizations. And for that reason, it's very difficult for me to consider myself a Pan-Africanist. I think I'm too patriotic to see myself as a Pan-Africanist. But notable Pan-Africanist elements: she supported liberation struggles in Africa, such as Angola and South Africa, and saw them linked to Black struggles in the US. She emphasized the shared identity of African-descended peoples as part of one struggle. She's often cited in Pan-Africanist and Black liberation literature as an example of diaspora resistance. In short, while not a formal Pan-Africanist leader, Assata Shakur's worldview and activism clearly clarified Pan-Africanist themes, connecting the African-American fight for liberation with African and global struggles against oppression. So she surely was a Pan-Africanist. So this is one Pan-Africanist that FBA can support. Granted that she was a Pan-Africanist, they still support her. They don't support Pan-Africanism, but they will support Assata. And the reason they'll support Assata, I believe, is because of, her other activist leanings, her more socialist, Black Panther, leftist type of leanings are, in my view, the main reason why FBA, which are Foundational Black Americans, that to me is the main reason they support her, is because of she was left-leaning, not because of her Pan-Africanism. And then I asked, was she a communist? And it says, Assata Shakur was not formally a member of the Communist Party, but her politics were deeply influenced by Marxist, socialist, and anti-imperialist ideas. Yeah, so again, I think that's, the same as the Black Panther Party. I think the BLA, the Black Liberation Army, I think that was the main leanings of those groups. They were mainly a left, Marxist, socialist type of people, and that was what their ideology was based in. Why people connect her to communism, the Black Panther Party influence. The Panthers studied Marxism, Leninism, and Maoism, blending those ideas with Black liberation struggles. Assata absorbed this political education. The Black Liberation Army, BLA, the BLA, which she later joined, adopted an explicitly revolutionary, anti-capitalist stance, arguing that capitalism and imperialism were inseparable from racism in the US. So this FBA supports her not because of her Pan-Africanism, but because of her revolutionary anti-capitalism, that left-leaning socialist, anti-capitalist, anti-imperialist movement is what FBA supports and why they mourn for Assata. And it's very interesting to me because, FBA claimed to have built this country. They claim that everything having to do with this country was built by them. But I guess it's everything except the capitalism, because they're anti-capitalist. They support left-leaning anti-capitalists who want to see America destroyed, because that was a part of Assata Shakur's mission, was destroying this this capitalist imperialist state. So, I find it very difficult to understand how FBA claimed to have built this country, but they support anyone who aims to destroy it. And that's a hint to me that they really did not. They really didn't build this country. They could not have. You build this country, there's no way you're going to be so invested or vested in destroying it or supporting people who are vested in destroying it. And Black people in America throughout the centuries have always sided and supported people that want to destroy America and see it as a systemically racist, white supremacist country. But somehow they built it. They built the country, but they want to destroy it, which is just interesting to me. Her writings, in Assata, an autobiography, she often critiques capitalism, describing it as exploitative and tied to the oppression of Black people and colonized nations. So again, America has always been a capitalist country, so FBA could not have built this country. No way could they have built this country, because they've always felt that the capitalism that this country is built around, or which is the foundation of this country, capitalism is the foundation of this country. So Black people cannot be foundational because they don't like capitalism. They've never appreciated American capitalism for the most part. You know, the Black Power movement is centered around, you know, anti-capitalist ideology. Her position: she didn't brand herself strictly as a communist, but rather as a revolutionary socialist and Pan-Africanist. A revolutionary. When they say they're revolutionary, that means their whole thing is change. They want to bring about change. And in this respect, it's changing America and everything that America represents. So, you know, that's fundamentally what FBA is also about. Her worldview blended Black nationalism, socialism, and third world liberation politics, much like other radical Black activists of her time. Yeah, most of the Black activists during the Black Power movement were absolutely anti-capitalists and can be seen as Black nationalists who wanted to separate from America and kind of create their own Black socialist state, if you will. And I think that's also the goal of Pan-Africanism. Pan-Africanism, I think, fundamentally wants to create, you know, kind of a socialist African state, and if not an African state, a socialist African union. ChatGPT suggested that I look at a breakdown of how her economic views compared with those of the Panthers and other 1970s radicals. And I said, okay, let's hear it. Assata Shakur's economic views: anti-capitalist stance. She consistently argued that U.S. capitalism was built on slavery, land theft, and systemic racism. And U.S. capitalism, again, is the foundation of America, which again is another hint that FBA did not build America. FBA is more interested in breaking America down and destroying America than building America. The link between racism and economics. In her view, racism wasn't just about prejudice, but a tool of economic exploitation. Cheap labor, prison labor, segregated housing markets, etc. Socialism as an alternative. She praised socialist systems like Cuba for guaranteeing healthcare, education, and basic needs, contrasting this with U.S. inequality. And again, I think this is true of the majority, if not all, of those Black Power activists of her time. Global solidarity. She tied Black struggles to anti-colonial struggles in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, where socialist movements were fighting imperialism. You know, so even though FBA are you know, strictly against Pan-Africanism, Assata Shakur was a strong Pan-Africanist who saw her connection to Africa and respected her connection to Africa and saw Africa as part of her vision. Her vision of how to conquer imperialism. The Black Panther Party. survival programs. The BPP launched free breakfast programs, health clinics, and education initiatives. Practical examples of socialist ideas applied to Black communities. Marxist-Leninist influence. Leaders like Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver studied Marx, Lenin, and Mao. They saw capitalism as the root of racial oppression. Economic critique. Panthers argued that Black people could never achieve freedom under U.S. capitalism, since the system relied on exploitation and racial divisions. And again, this system could not have been created by Blacks. Community control. They emphasized taking control of local resources, land, and institutions to build self-determined Black communities. And I think those self-determined Black communities are communities that's based in socialist ideals. Other 1970s radicals, Black radicals, Nation of Islam. Unlike Shakur and the Panthers, the NOI wasn't Marxist. They leaned toward Black capitalism, building independent Black-owned businesses as a path to liberation. The SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, under Stokely Carmichael or Kwame Ture, by the late 1960s, SNCC turned toward Pan-Africanism and socialism, seeing U.S. capitalism as inseparable from imperialism. The Republic of New Africa, RNA, called for land reparations and an independent Black nation in the U.S. South. Their vision combined nationalism and socialism. So the key differences, Shakur and BPP, or the Black Panthers, they both saw socialism as essential to Black liberation, linking community needs to systemic change. The NOI promoted moral reform and Black enterprise, not socialism. Pan-Africanists like Kwame Ture connected U.S. struggles with global socialist revolutions, aligning closely with Assata's outlook. In summary, Assata Shakur's economic views aligned most with the Panthers and global socialist movements, anti-capitalist, pro-socialist, and anti-imperialist. She diverged from groups like the NOI, who emphasized Black capitalism instead of socialism. So again, I think this kind of explains why FBA would mourn Assata Shakur, but cheer for the death of Charlie Kirk, because where Charlie Kirk was absolutely a capitalist, absolutely an American patriot who valued American values, Assata Shakur was the flip of that. She was an anti-American, anti-capitalist, pro-socialism individual. And Black Americans tend more to lean towards the anti-American side of the coin than the patriotic side of the coin for whatever reason. And again, that's why they could not have created this country. They fight too hard. Black Americans fight way too hard against what America stands for to have been the people to have created this country. And just to kind of go into, I guess I wanted a more in-depth explanation as to how much the Black Panthers and the BLA were against the American way of life. So I asked ChatGPT, how were they funded? Who was funding the BPP? And it said, good question. Funding was a constant challenge for both the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army. And the way they raised money reflected their different strategies. The Black Panther Party, the BPP operated as a political and community-based organization. So its funding was a mix of legitimate fundraising and donations. Membership dues. Panthers paid small dues to support the organization. Community donations. Local businesses and sympathetic individuals donated food, supplies, and money to support Panther programs like the Free Breakfast for Children program, free health clinics, and housing initiatives. Fundraising events. They sold newspapers, the Black Panther, and organized rallies, concerts, and speaking tours to raise funds. Alliances with celebrities. High-profile supporters like Marlon Brando, Jane Fonda, Leonard Bernstein, and Harry Belafonte sometimes donated money or helped raise awareness. International solidarity. Some funds and resources also came from sympathetic groups abroad, for example, from revolutionary movements and governments that opposed U.S. imperialism. And that's pretty much what I was kind of looking to see, if there were any foreign investment into the BPP from people that would be considered to be enemies of America. And I think it's obvious that there absolutely were. They said, these were coming from revolutionary movements, which I would presume are movements or groups that the US government would consider terrorist organizations. So I'm not surprised at all. It says the FBI's COINTELPRO program often tried to disrupt these revenue streams, pressuring businesses not to donate and targeting fundraising events. The Black Liberation Army. The BLA operated clandestinely, underground, and rejected traditional fundraising, relying instead on illegal means to sustain itself. Bank robberies or expropriations. They believed seizing money from banks was justified, since banks were seen as institutions of capitalist exploitation. Yeah, the BLA was next level. Like, these guys went all out. Armored car robberies. Notably, the BLA carried out several high-profile armed robberies in the 1970s. Support networks. Sympathetic activists and underground networks provided housing, food, and safe houses, though less openly for the BPP, for the Black Panthers. International support. While smaller than the BPP, the BLA had ties to international revolutionary movements, including in Cuba, which sometimes provided safe harbor more than direct funds. And I guess that kind of helped her to get extradited to Cuba, or, for her to escape and get welcomed into Cuba with just all of those revolutionary ties that she had there. Because of this reliance on armed actions, the BLA was heavily pursued by law enforcement and quickly fragmented under FBI pressure. So the key contrast is that the BPP tried to operate as a legitimate political organization with above-ground funding, though harassed by the state. The BLA operated as a guerrilla underground, relying on robberies and clandestine support. In summary, the BPP was sustained by donations, dues, fundraising events, and some international solidarity, while the BLA funded itself primarily through armed robberies and underground support networks. So the next question I asked is, were the international revolutionary movements that supported them, were they socialist groups? And it says yes. The international revolutionary movements that supported the Black Panthers and the Black Liberation Army were overwhelmingly socialist, Marxist, or anti-imperialist groups. Their support came less from liberal allies in the West and more from countries and movements aligned with the global socialist and anti-colonial struggle of the Cold War era. So these were groups that are, that splintered off after, I guess, Russia broke apart. But that Cold War continued, I believe, afterwards, with people and organizations still trying to infiltrate and destroy America from within. And I think the Black Panther Party, the Black Liberation Army, were all part of that movement to destroy America. I think hip hop was also a part of that movement to destroy America. Yeah. And so, again, Assata Shakur is supported, valued, and mourned by FBA for just that reason, because she was attempting to destroy America. And FBA, as much as they claim to have built America, will do anything to support people who want to destroy it. Go figure. The Black Panther Party's international support. The Panthers built explicit ties with socialist and anti-colonial movements abroad. In China, the BPP admired Mao Zedong's writings and drew from Maoist strategies. Chinese officials offered symbolic support, printing materials, and expressing solidarity. In Algeria, the BPP set up an international office in Algiers in 1969, which became a hub for connections with liberation groups. Vietnam. So look, these people had a lot of international support from countries that were not our friends in any way, shape, or form. Vietnam. The Panthers expressed solidarity with the Viet Cong during the Vietnam War, seeing parallels between U.S. imperialism abroad and racism at home. Cuba. Panthers visited Havana, where Cuba welcomed U.S. black radicals as part of its revolutionary internationalism. African liberation movements. They connected with groups fighting colonialism in Angola, the MPLA, in Mozambique, the FRELIMO, in Guinea-Bissau and South Africa, the ANC and the PAC. Next, the Black Liberation Army. International links. The BLA was smaller and underground, but it drew support from some of the same networks. Cuba. Cuba offered asylum to Assata Shakur and other exiles. Cuba saw them as part of the global anti-imperialist struggle. Algeria. Some BLA members connected with Panthers in Algiers, though the BLA was less organized internationally. Palestinian groups. There were reported contacts with Palestinian liberation movements who shared training and ideology. African liberation fronts. The BLA expressed solidarity, though their capacity to materially link up was limited compared to the Panthers. While these guys were linked with Palestinian groups. And we all know the Palestinian organizations are quite anti-African, anti-American. Palestinians are down with Israel and down with America. So the Black Panthers, the Black Liberation Army, and Assata Shakur, with her membership, were all anti-American, anti-capitalist individuals, or groups, if you will. But that's what was their main motivation, was being revolutionary and trying to bring about the destruction of imperialism, and the biggest imperialist of them all, which is the United States of America. Why socialist movements backed them? Anti-imperialism. Both the BPP and BLA framed the US not just as racist, but as the world's leading imperialist power. Shared ideology. Marxist, socialist, and Pan-African movements saw the struggles of Black Americans as part of a global class and colonial struggle. Cold War context. Supporting U.S. radicals was a way for socialist states like Cuba, China, USSR to challenge American legitimacy. There you have it. Their main goal was to make America illegitimate. And why would the people who claim they built this country be the first people to support any movement to illegitimize that same country that they claim they created from the ground up. They claim that everything about America, they did it. But everything about America, they want to destroy. So in summary, yes, the international allies of the BPP and BLA were overwhelmingly socialist, anti-imperialist, and anti-colonial movements. The support came from places like Cuba, China, Algeria, Vietnam, and African liberation fronts, all of which saw U.S. black radicals as part of the same worldwide struggle against colonialism and capitalism. Isn't that something? So I wanted to ask ChatGPT one other question, because most of what they listed in terms of the international support so far have been non-white countries. So I asked, did BPP or BLA get support from European revolutionary groups? And it says yes, both the Black Panther Party and to a lesser extent the BLA received support or solidarity from European revolutionary and leftist groups during the late 1960s and 70s. The Black Panther Party and Europe. The BPP was internationally visible and built ties with radical European movements. In Britain, the British Black Panther movement, founded in London in 1968, modeled itself directly after the US Panthers. Figures like Darcus Howe and Olive Morris drew heavily on BPP ideology. Support also came from segments of the British left, especially Trotskyist and socialist organizations. In France, French student radicals from the May 1968 uprising expressed solidarity with the Panthers. The French left often linked US racism to colonialism in Africa and the Caribbean. In Germany, the Red Army faction and other militant groups saw the Panthers as part of the global anti-imperialist struggle. Panthers had contacts with German students and leftists involved in anti-NATO and anti-Vietnam War activism. In Scandinavia, radical groups in Sweden and Denmark raised money for Panther survival programs and gave platforms for exiled Panthers to speak. International conferences. Panthers sent representatives to events like the 1969 Pan-African Cultural Festival in Algiers, where they connected with European leftists, African liberation movements, and socialist states. The Black Liberation Army and Europe. The BLA was smaller and underground, so it had fewer open ties. But sympathizers in Britain, France, and Germany, especially among student radicals, offered rhetorical support. Some radical European groups, like the RAF in Germany and the Irish Republican Army, shared tactics and, in some cases, contacts with BLA-linked activists. However, unlike the Panthers, the BLA never built broad international offices or public networks in Europe. Why European groups supported them? Anti-imperialist unity. European radicals often viewed the US as the center of global imperialism. The Panthers and BLA represented resistance from within. Race and colonialism. For Europeans from colonial powers, Britain, France, Portugal, the US Black struggle echoed African and Caribbean liberation struggles. Counterculture solidarity. Many youth movements, especially after 1968, looked to the Panthers as models of militant resistance. Yeah, so it seems to me that, the Europeans, even though they kind of, labeled their movement as, and their support for these movements in America, they supported them as the US Black struggle that echoed African and Caribbean liberation struggles. And I think the reason they echoed them is because these struggles were pro-socialist struggles. So I think that mainly what those Europeans were concerned with, because these were mainly leftist socialist groups. Their main concern was not with the freedom of blacks, but with, you know, getting socialism in place and promoting socialist ideals. I think that is fundamentally what they were interested in. So in summary, it says the BPP actively built ties with European revolutionary groups, from Britain's Black Panthers to Germany's RAF and broader socialist movements across Europe. The BLA, being underground, had looser connections, but still drew sympathy from radical groups who saw them as part of the global anti-imperialist fight. I then asked, did BLA or BPP work with or get support from international terrorist groups? And ChatGPT says this is a sharp question, because the line between revolutionary movements and what the US government labeled as terrorist groups was very blurry during the Cold War. The short answer, yes, both the BPP and to a smaller degree the BLA had ties with armed revolutionary groups abroad, many of which were branded as terrorist by the US and its allies. So again, FBA, Black Power movements, for whatever reason, always tend to put their support behind leftist, Marxist, terrorists, organizations that promote terrorism within America, because their goal is the destruction of that imperialist, capitalist, colonialist system which exists in America. And not to keep repeating myself, but FBA, Foundational Black Americans, did not build this capitalist, imperialist, colonialist system that they always tend to want to destroy. That's a contradiction that they will never, in my view, be able to rectify. The Black Panther Party. The BPP saw itself as part of a global anti-imperialist front, not an isolated US group. They built ties with Algerian National Liberation Front, the FLN. The Panthers opened an international office in Algiers with FLN support. Algeria gave safe haven to exiled revolutionaries from many countries. And exiled revolutionaries are people that committed terrorist acts elsewhere. Algeria just brought them in. And a number of these people may have been Americans and Black Panther Party members, because, you know, Assata Shakur herself was exiled in Cuba. And she, you know, what she did to get arrested, involved with the murder of that police officer, those types of things can be seen as terrorist, and I think they may have been. Palestinian groups, the PLO and PFLP. Panthers expressed solidarity with the Palestinian struggle. Some Panthers in Algiers and elsewhere met with Palestinian groups like the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, who were labeled as terrorists by the US and Israel. Cuban revolutionaries. Cuba welcomed Panthers and offered training, political asylum, and international legitimacy. Cuba was often accused by the US of supporting terrorism worldwide. Vietnamese communists, the Viet Cong or North Vietnam. Panthers expressed solidarity and exchanged delegations with Vietnamese representatives during the war. The Black Liberation Army. The BLA was smaller, underground, and more militant. Its international ties were fewer, but they did exist. In Cuba granted asylum to Assata Shakur and other exiled BLA members. Havana saw them as part of the global fight against US imperialism. Palestinian fighters, reports especially from the FBI, and let me just say, where Havana saw them as part of the global fight against US imperialism, for the most part, I think blacks in America, the black people in America, just saw the Black Panthers as people that were just interested in the local black struggle and the freedom of black Americans. But, you know, their goal, and absolutely the goal of those international groups and even countries that supported them was bigger than that. It wasn't just about the black struggle. It was more about an anti-imperialist, pro-socialism movement, a pro-Marxist, Leninist movement. Palestinian fighters, reports, especially from the FBI, suggested that some Black Liberation Army members sought or received training with Palestinian groups in the Middle East during the 70s. Whether this was widespread or limited remains debated, but the ideological connection was real. Other armed movements. There were ideological affinities with groups like the Irish Republican Army, the IRA, or the Red Army faction in Germany, though hard evidence of joint operations is thin. The U.S. government's framing. To the U.S. state, any armed revolutionary ally, whether African Liberation Fronts, Palestinian fighters, or Cuban communists, could be branded as terrorists. To the BPP and BLA, these were legitimate liberation movements, fighting the same imperialist system oppressing Black Americans. Now, you know, my take on it as the American dream and as someone who values capitalism, I think from my view, capitalism promotes freedom more than socialism or communism ever can. And capitalism has been proven to work to free people and take people out of poverty way more than socialism or communism ever have. So from just an ideological perspective, just comparing capitalism to socialism, I'm a capitalist. And I think the values of capitalism are more linked with the values of freedom and individual freedom than socialism. Socialism is not about individual freedom in any way. And so for that reason alone, I am pro-capitalist. And so for that reason alone, I am more prone to support the US state. You know, all of this other talk about colonialism and imperialism, I'm not interested in that context. I'm interested in their work as capitalists because I think, you know, the colonialism and the imperialism part, I think they claim it kind of comes out of capitalism. I think their view is that colonialism and imperialism are products of capitalism. So capitalism is at the heart of really what they're against. That's why Pan-Africanists are also anti-capitalist. I think that's the heart of what they're fighting against is capitalism. And for that reason, I can't support the BPP or the BLA or any of that Marxist Leninist stuff because I think fundamentally, just on the idea, just on their ideology, capitalism is a better idea and a better way to create a society than socialism. Again, socialism has never been proven to work anywhere. So in summary, it says, yes, the BPP openly aligned with international revolutionary groups like the FLN, PLO, and Cuba, while the BLA had limited but real connections, mainly through Cuba and possible Palestinian training links. These relationships show how deeply tied the U.S. Black Liberation Army struggle was to the global anti-colonial and socialist front, which the U.S. often labeled as terrorist movements. And listen, what kind of training are they getting from the Palestinians? They're going to Palestine for training. What type of training? Is this army training, like terrorist army training? You know, I can't think of what other training they would be going there for. Because it's not as if they weren't involved in terrorist attacks. You know, we read before how many of these things they were involved with. But let's just kind of go back and talk mainly about Assata Shakur, and I guess kind of what her legacy would be. I wanted to speak a little bit. I wanted to speak about the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army, because you can't really have a conversation about Assata Shakur without speaking about these organizations. So I kind of want to go back now and, just to close this off, speak about how is her legacy best explained. And that's the question I presented to ChatGPT. And it says, Assata Shakur's legacy is best explained as a contested symbol at the intersection of Black liberation, U.S. state power, and global anti-imperialist struggle. Her story represents both the radical hopes of 1960s and 70s Black movements and the lasting controversy of armed resistance in America. To many activists, especially in the U.S. and the African diaspora, she represents the continuation of the struggle against racism, police brutality, and systemic oppression. Her autobiography, Assata, has become a classic text, often studied alongside works by Angela Davis, Malcolm X, and Frantz Fanon. She embodies the Pan-African and socialist vision that connected Black Americans to global liberation movements. Number 2, she's an example of state repression. Her case highlights the COINTELPRO era, when the FBI actively sought to neutralize Black radical movements through surveillance, infiltration, and criminal charges. For supporters, her conviction shows how Black radicals were unfairly targeted. For her critics, it demonstrates the dangers of violent extremism. She became a fugitive and political exile, reinforcing both sides of this narrative: resistance to oppression versus flight from justice. Flight from justice. She fled. Wait, she's an FBA and she fled. Is that considered fleeing? So FBA flee their country to go to terrorists, to join other terrorist countries. FBA do terrorism in their homeland that they created and then flee for a socialist safe haven. FBA flee too, bro. FBA flee too. Number 3, international symbol. In Cuba, she became part of the global anti-imperialist camp, embraced by socialist movements as a refugee from U.S. oppression. Her continued asylum has kept her in the headlines, especially whenever U.S.-Cuba relations are debated. For Pan-Africanists and Third World liberationists, she represents diaspora solidarity with decolonization struggles worldwide. So she has a divided legacy. Supporters see her as a freedom fighter, revolutionary, and survivor of political persecution. And that, I think, is the reason why FBA support her and mourn her death, is because FBA, they support people that label themselves freedom fighters, revolutionaries, and just anti-Americans. FBA, for people who claim to have created America, for people who claim to have built America, FBA always support people that want to destroy America. Opponents see her as a convicted cop killer and terrorist who escaped justice. This duality means her name can evoke inspiration, fear, or controversy, depending on who tells her story. In short, Assata Shakur's legacy is best explained as that of a revolutionary icon of Black liberation, Pan-Africanism, and socialism, whose life also embodies the intense repression of radical movements in the U.S. and the global fault lines of the Cold War. She remains a living bridge between the struggles of the Civil Rights Black Power era and contemporary movements against systemic racism. Yeah, I think that pretty much says it all. I think that pretty much says it all. And again, I think, for me anyway, it fully explains why FBA and Black Americans as well, it's not just FBA, most Black Americans will mourn Assata, but they will cheer the death of Charlie Kirk. Because again, Charlie Kirk represents patriotism. Charlie Kirk represents capitalism. And he represents the American dream, or the American way of life. That's what Charlie Kirk represents, and that's what Charlie Kirk pushed for and spoke up for, was the American way of life. Assata Shakur was the complete opposite. She spoke against the American way of life. She spoke against capitalism. Everything that America stood for, Assata Shakur rejected or fought against. And not just fought against vocally, fought against like on the battlefield. And so FBA, they claim to have built America, but one of their main goals is destroying America. Go figure. Yeah, I think that's about it. I think that's about it for this reading. I think there's also, the only other thing I was interested in, because I always thought she was Tupac's mom. And I've always, because, Tupac Shakur, Assata Shakur. So the last thing I asked was she Tupac's mom? And ChatGPT says not exactly, but there's a close family connection. Afeni Shakur, born Alice Faye Williams, was Tupac Shakur's mother. She was also a leading member of the Black Panther Party in New York and a revolutionary activist in her own right. Assata Shakur, born JoAnne Chesimard, was not Tupac's biological mother, but she is his step-aunt. Says, here's how. Afeni and Assata were very close in the Panther movement. Tupac grew up referring to Assata as Aunt Assata, and she served as a mentor and inspiration for him. He even dedicated the song Letter to the Unborn to her, and his album Until the End of Time includes references to her. So in summary, Afeni Shakur is Tupac's mother, and Assata Shakur is Tupac's godmother or step-aunt and revolutionary influence. All right, so I think that pretty much does it for the legacy of Assata Shakur, as far as I see it, or rather, as far as ChatGPT sees it. Yeah, and I think that is a pretty good representation of what her legacy is. And I also think that's a pretty good representation in terms of just my view as well. I think my view is a pretty good representation of the reasons why FBA support Assata Shakur and mourn her death, but absolutely do not support anything about Charlie Kirk and cheer for his death, because they are, as I've said before, they are opposite coins of the American coin, where one is pro-American, the other one is absolutely anti-American. So yeah, man, thank you for your time. If you don't mind hitting that like button, that would be great. I'm gonna take my leave. You know what I mean? It's Sunday. I got soccer games to go to with my boy. So until the next time, holla at your boy.
I want you to listen very, very carefully.
It's all about life in the street. People are suffer, try survive in the heat. Bad mind them up to one, hygiene not eat. That's why enough of them, rifle a beat. Everybody want big ups, I want to drive in a Jeep. Every day I'm at the ball when she bike in a read. Not even 5 days, we can't find for the week. Me no see no changes, the same cycle repeat. Give thanks cause life it's a sweet, but keep an eye open every time you go sleep. Cause mankind jealous and them idle go rape. Them never yet plant and not try figure rape. Bigger heads where you fight for the seat. Now care about the future nor the child where you creep. Them a pray the fat Kyle we submit. The system will slide where you fit.
Inna the streets so we born and grow. Only Jah know and nobody know.
When we talk about ghetto life, talk about ghetto life,
Everybody a priest say them want the dough. That's why them a speed and they on the go.
Cause this a real ghetto life, this a real ghetto life, yeah. Everybody just a pre-success. When me looking at the street, you me see enough stress. Them all a fight for who reach up next. Everybody want floss and a beat up chest. Juvenile in a them teen love sex. Them a breed the fast money, them no need subjects. And if you're unfortunate, please don't vex. I saw the things said cause the streets don't rest.
Inna the streets so we born and grow. Only Jah know and nobody know.
When we talk about ghetto life, talk about ghetto life,
Everybody a priest say them want the dough. That's why them a speed and they on the go.
Cause this a real ghetto life, this a real ghetto life, yeah. It's all about life in the street. People are suffer, try survive in the heat. Bad mind them up to one, hygiene a do it. That's why enough of them, yeah, rifle a beat. Everybody want the guns and want to drive in a Jeep. Every day I'm at the ball when she buy in a read. Not even 5 wheels you can't find for the week. Me no see no changes, the same cycle repeat. Give thanks cause life it's a sweet. But keep an eye open every time you go sleep. Cause mankind jealous and them idle go late. Them never yet plant and not try figure rape. Bigger heads where you fight for the seat. Now care about the future nor the child where you creep. Them a pray the fat Kyle we submit. The system will slide where you fit.
Inna the streets so we born and grow. Only Jah know and nobody know.
When we talk about ghetto life, talk about ghetto life,
Everybody a priest say them want the dough. That's why them a speed and they on the go.
Cause this a real ghetto life, this a real ghetto life, yeah.